for centuries, hidden away in darkness. Tortured by thirst, choking down dust, starving. Until now, our hunt begins again.
The mortal said nothing, looking helplessly at Horus. The lodge members waited for him to announce himself, but no name was forthcoming. "Why does he not identify himself?" asked Aximand. "He can't say," replied Horus with a smile. "Sorry. I couldn't resist, Sergar. This is Magard, and he is mute. It has come to my attention that he wishes to learn more of our legion, and I thought this might be a way of showing him our true faces." "He will be made welcome," assured Aximand. "But you didn't come here just to bring us 2 new members, did you?" "Always thinking, little Horus," laughed Horus. "I've always said you were the wise one." "Then why are you here?" asked Aximand.
"Aximand," hissed Targost. "This is the War Master. He goes where he wills."
Horus held up his hand and said, "It's all right, Sergar. Little Horus has a right to ask. I've kept out of your affairs for long enough, so it's only fair I explain this sudden visit." Horus walked between them, smiling and bathing them in the force of his personality. He stood before Aximand, and the effect was intoxicating. Horus had always been a being of supreme majesty, whose beauty and charisma could bewitch even the most stoic hearts. As he met the War Master's gaze, Aximand saw that his power to seduce was beyond anything he had experienced before, and he felt shame that he had questioned this luminous being. What right did he have to ask anything of the War Master? Horus winked, and the spell was broken. The War Master moved into the center of the group and said, "You are right to gather and debate the coming days, my sons, for they will be hard indeed. Times are upon us when we must make difficult decisions, and there will be those who will not understand why we do what we do, because they were not here beside us." Horus stopped before each of the captains in turn, and Aximand could see the effect his words were having on him. Each warrior's face lit up as though the sun shone upon him. "I am set upon a course that will affect every man under my command, and the burden of my decision is a heavy weight upon my shoulders, my sons."
"Share it with us," cried Abaddon. "We are ready to serve."
Horus smiled and said, "I know you are, Ezekiel, and it gives me strength to know that I have warriors with me who are as steadfast and true as you."
"We are yours to command," promised Sergar Targost. "Our first loyalty is to you."
"I am proud of you all," said Horus, his voice emotional. "But I have one last thing to ask of you."
"Ask us,"
said Abaddon. Horus placed his hand gratefully on Abaddon's shoulder guard and said, "Before you answer, consider what I am about to say carefully. If you choose to follow me on this grand adventure, there will be no turning back once we have embarked upon it. For good or ill, we go forward, never back."
"You always were one for theatrics,"
noted Aximand. "Are you going to get to the point?" Horus nodded and said, "Yes, of course, little Horus. But you'll indulge my sense for the dramatic, I hope. It wouldn't be you otherwise." "Agreed," said Horus. "But yes, to get to the point. I am about to take us down the most dangerous path, and not all of us will survive. There will be those of the Imperium who will call us traitors and rebels for our actions. But you must ignore their bleatings and trust that I am certain of our course. The days ahead will be hard and painful, but we must see them through to the end."
"What would you have us do?"
asked Abaddon. "In good time, Ezekiel. In good time," said Horus. "I just need to know that you are with me, my sons. Are you with me?"
"We are with you,"
shouted the warriors as one. "Thank you," said Horus, gratefully. "But before we act, We must set our own house in order. Hector Varvarus and this remembrancer, Carcassy. They must be silenced while we gather our strength. They draw unwelcome attention to us, and that is unacceptable.
Varvarus is not a man to change his mind, my lord, warned Aximan, and the remembrancer is under Garviel's protection.
I will take care of Varvarus, said the Warmaster. And the remembrancer, well, I'm sure that with the correct persuasion he will do the right thing.
What do you intend, my lord?
Asked Aximan.
That they be illuminated as to the error of their ways, said Horus.
20. The Breach. A midday clear. Plans. The visit of the Emperor's children was painfully brief, the two Primarchs sequestering themselves behind closed doors for its entirety, while their warriors sparred, drank, and talked of war. Whatever passed between the Warmaster and Fulgrim appeared to satisfy the Primarch of the Emperor's children that all was well, and 3 days later an honor guard formed up at the upper transit tunnel as the sons of Horus bade their farewells to the Emperor's children. Saul Tarvitz and Torgadden said heartfelt goodbyes, while Lucius and Loken exchanged wry handshakes, each anticipating the next time they would cross blades. Eidolon nodded curtly to Torgadden and Loken, as Apothecary Fabius made his exit without a word. Fulgrim and Horus shared a brotherly embrace, whispering words only they could hear to one another. The wondrously perfect Primarch of the Emperor's children turned with a flourish towards the pressure door and stepped from the vengeful spirit, his long, scale cloak billowing behind him. Something glinted beneath the cloak, and Loken did a double take as he caught a fleeting glimpse of a horribly familiar golden sword belted at Fulgrim's waist. Loken saw that the Iron Citadel was aptly named, its gleaming walls rearing from the rock like jagged metal teeth. The mid-morning light reflected from its shimmering walls, the air rippling in the haze of energy fields, and clouds of metal shavings raining down from self-repairing ramparts. The outer precincts of the fortress were in ruins, the result of a 4-month siege waged by the warriors of Angron and the war machines of the Mechanicum. The Dies Irae and her sister titans bombarded the walls daily, hurling high explosive shells and crackling energy beams at the citadel, slowly but surely pushing the Brotherhood back to this, their last bastion. The citadel itself was a colossal half-moon in plan, set against the rock of a range of white mountains, its approach guarded by scores of hornworks and redoubts. Most of these fortifications were little more than smouldering rubble, the Mechanicum's Legio Reductor Corps having expended a fearsome amount of ordnance to flatten them in preparation for the storm of the Iron Citadel. After months of constant shelling, the walls of the citadel had finally been broken open, and a half-kilometer-wide breach had been torn in its shining walls. The citadel was ready to fall, but the Brotherhood would fight for it to the bitter end, and Loken knew that most of the warriors who were to climb that breach would die. He waited for the order of battle with trepidation, knowing that an escalade was the surest way for a warrior to meet his end. Statistically, a man was almost certain to die when assaulting the walls of a well-defended fortress, and it was therefore beholden to him to make that death worthwhile. "Will it be soon, do you think, Garvey?" asked Michaels, checking the action of his chainsaw for the umpteenth time. "I think so," said Loken. "But I imagine that the World Eaters will be the first to the breach." "Welcome to the honor," grunted Torgadden, and Loken was surprised at his comrade's sentiment. Torgadden was normally the first to request a place in the spear tip of any battle, though he had been withdrawn and sullen for some time now. He would not be drawn on the reasons why, but Loken knew it had to do with Aximand and Abaddon. Their fellow Mournival members had barely spoken to them over the course of this war, except where operational necessity had demanded it. Neither had the four of them met Warmaster since Davin. For all intents and purposes, the Mournival was no more. The Warmaster kept his own counsel, and Loken found himself in agreement with Yacton Cruz's sentiments that the Legion had lost its way. The words of the half-herd carried no real weight in the sons of Horus, and the aged veteran's complaints were largely ignored. Loken's growing suspicions had been fed by what Apothecary Vadden had told him, when he had rushed to the Medicaid deck after the departure of the Emperor's children. He had found the apothecary in the midst of surgery, ministering to the Legion's wounded, the tiled floor slicked with congealed blood. Loken had known better than to disturb Vaden's labours, and only when the apothecary had finished did Loken speak to him.
The anatheme,
Demanded Loken.
where is it?
Vaden looked up from washing his hands of blood. Captain Loken, the anatheme. I don't have it anymore. I thought you knew.
No,
Said Loken.
I didn't. What happened to it? I told you to tell no one that it was in your possession.
And nor did I, said Vaden angrily. He already knew I had it.
He?
Asked Loken.
Who are you talking about?
The apothecary of the Emperor's children. Fabius, said Vaden. He came to the Medicaid deck a few hours ago and told me he had been authorized to remove it. A cold chill seized Loken as he asked,
Authorized by whom?
By the War Master, said Vaden.
And you just gave it him?
Asked Loken.
Just like that?
What was I supposed to do? Snarled Vaden. This Fabius had the War Master's seal. I had to give it to him. Loken took a deep, calming breath, knowing that the apothecary would have had no choice when presented with the seal of Horus. The months of research Vaden had performed on the weapon had, thus far, yielded no results, and with its removal from the vengeful spirit, any chance of uncovering its secrets was lost forever. A crackling voice in Loken's helmet shook him from his sour memory of the second theft of the anatheme, and he focused on the order of battle streaming through his headset. Sure enough, the World Eaters were going in first, a full assault company led by Angron himself and supported by 2 companies of the Sons of Horus, the 10th and the 2nd, Loken and Torgadon's companies. Torgadon and Loken shared an uneasy glance. To be given the honor of going into the breach seemed at odds with their current status within the Legion. But the order was given, and there was no changing it now. Army regiments would follow to secure the ground the Astartes won, and Hector Varvarus himself would lead these detachments. Loken shook hands with Torgadon and said,
See you on the inside, Tarek. Try not to get yourself killed, Garvey, said Torgadon. Thanks for the reminder, said Loken. Here was me thinking that was the point. Don't joke, Garvey, said Torgadon. I'm serious. I think we're going to need each other's support before this campaign is over. What do you mean? Never mind, said Torgadon. We'll talk more once this citadel is ours, eh? Yes, we'll share a bottle of victory wine in the ruins of the Brotherhood citadel.
Torgadon nodded and said,
You're buying, though.
They shook hands once more, and Torgadon jogged away to rejoin his warriors and ready them for the bloody assault. Loken watched him go, wondering if he would see his friend alive again to share that drink. He pushed such defeatism aside as he made his way through his own company to pass out orders and offer words of encouragement. He turned as a huge cheer erupted from further down the mountains, seeing a column of warriors clad in the blue and white armor of the World Eaters, marching towards the approaches to the breach. The assaulters of the World Eaters were hulking warriors equipped with mighty chain axes and heavy jump packs. They were brutality distilled, and concentrated violence molded them into the most fearsome close combat fighters Loken had ever seen. Leading them was the Primarch Angron. Angron, the Bloody One, the Red Angel. Loken had heard all these names and more for Angron, but none of them did justice to the sheer brutal physicality of the Primarch of the World Eaters. Clad in an ancient suit of gladiatorial armor, Angron was like a warrior from some lost heroic age. A glinting mesh cape of chainmail hung from his high gorget and pauldron, with skulls worked into its wreath like barbaric trophies. He was armed to the teeth with short, stabbing swords and daggers the length of an Astartes chainblade. An ornate pistol of antique design was holstered on each thigh, and he carried a monstrous chain glaive, its terrifying size beyond anything Loken could believe. Thrown alive, breathed Nero Vipers as Angron approached. I wouldn't have believed it had I not seen it with my own eyes.
I know what you mean,
answered Loken, the mighty Primarch's savage and tribal appearance putting him in mind of the bloody tales he had read in the chronicles of Ursh. Angron's face was murder itself, his thick features scarred and bloody. Dark iron glinted on his scalp where cerebral cortex implants punctured the skull to amplify his already fearsome aggression. The implants had been grafted to Angron's brain when he had been a slave, centuries before, and though the technology to remove them was available, he had never wanted them removed. The bloody Primarch marched past, glancing over at the men of 10th Company as he led his warriors towards the bloodletting. Loken shivered at the sight of him, seeing only death in his heavy-lidded eyes, and he wondered what terrible thoughts must fill Angron's violated skull. No sooner had the Primarch of the World Eaters passed than the bombardment began, the guns of the Legio Mortis launching rippling salvos of rockets and shells into the breach. Loken watched as Angron delivered his assault orders with curt chops of his glaive, and felt a momentary pity for the Brotherhood warriors within the citadel. Though they were his sworn enemies, he did not envy them the prospect of fighting such a living avatar of blood and death. A terrifying war cry sounded from the World Eaters, and Loken watched as Angron led his company in a crude ritual of scarification. The warriors removed their left gauntlets and slashed their axes across their palms, smearing the blood across the faceplates of their helmets as they chanted canticles of death and bloodshed. "I almost feel sorry for the poor bastards in the Citadel," said Vipers, echoing Loken's earlier thoughts.
Pass the word to stand ready, he ordered. We move out when the World Eaters reach the crest of the breach.
He held out his hand to Nero Vipers and said,
Kill for the living, Nero.
"Kill for the dead," answered Vipers. The assault began in a flurry of smoke as the World Eaters surged up the lower slopes of the breach with roaring blasts of their jump packs. The wallhead and the breach itself were wreathed in explosions from the Titan's bombardment, and the idea that something could live through such a storm of shot and shell seemed impossible to Loken. As the World Eaters powered up the slopes of rubble, Loken and his warriors clambered over the twisted, blackened spars of iron that had been blasted from the walls above. They moved and fired, adding their own volley of gunfire into the breach before the assaulters reached their targets. The slope was steep, but eminently climbable, and they were making steady progress. Occasional shots and las blasts ricocheted from the rocks or their armor, but at this range, nothing could wound them. 500 meters to his left, Loken saw Torgadden leading 2nd Company up the slopes in the wake of the World Eaters, both forces of the Sons of Horus protecting the vulnerable flanks of the assaulters and ready with heavier weapons to secure the breach. Behind the Astartes, the soldiers of Hector Varvarus's Byzant Janizars, wearing long cream greatcoats with gold frogging, followed in disciplined ranks. To march into battle in ceremonial dress uniforms seemed ridiculous to Loken, but Varvarus had declared that he and his men were not going to enter the citadel looking less than their best. Loken turned from the splendid sight of the marching soldiers as he heard a deep bass rumbling that seemed to come from the ground itself. Powdered rubble and rocks danced as the vibrations grew stronger still, and Loken knew that something was terribly wrong. Ahead, he could see Angron and the World Eaters reaching the crest of the breach. Blazing columns of smoke surrounded Angron, and Loken heard the mighty Primarch's bellowing cry of triumph, even over the thunderous explosions of battle. The rumbling grew louder and more violent, and Loken had to grip onto a rusted spar of rebar to hold himself in place as the ground continued to shake as though in the grip of a mighty earthquake. Great cracks split the ground, and plumes of fire shot from them.
What's happening?
He shouted over the noise. No one answered, and Loken fell as the top of the breach suddenly exploded in a sheet of flame that reached hundreds of meters into the air. Rocks and metal were hurled skywards as the top of the wall vanished in a massive seismic detonation. Like the bunkers in the cities, the Brotherhood destroyed what they could not hold, and Loken's reactive senses shut down briefly with the overload of light and noise. Twisted rubble and wreckage slammed down around them, and Loken heard screams of pain and the crack of splintering armor as scores of his men were pulverized by the storm of boulders. Dust and matter filled the air, and when Loken felt safe enough to move, he saw in horror that the entire crest of the breach had been destroyed. Angron and the World Eaters were gone, buried beneath the wreckage of a mountain. Torgadden saw the same thing, and picked himself up from the ground. He shouted at his warriors to get to their feet and charged towards the ruin of the breach. Filthy, Dust-covered warriors clambered from the wreckage and followed their captain as he led them onwards and upwards to what might be their deaths. Torgadden knew that such a course of action was probably suicidal, but he had seen Angron buried beneath the mountain, and retreating was not an option. He activated the blade of his chainsword and scrambled up the slopes with the feral cry of the sons of Horus bursting from his lips. "Lupercal! Lupercal!" he screamed as he charged. Loken watched his brother rise from the aftermath of the explosion like a true hero, and began his own charge towards the breach. He knew that there was every chance a second seismic mine was buried in the breach, but the sight of a Primarch brought low by the Brotherhood obliterated all thoughts of any tactical response, except charging. "Warriors of the 10th, he roared. "With me! Lupercal!" Loken's surviving warriors pulled themselves from the rubble and followed Loken with the War Master's name echoing from the mountains. Loken sprang from rock to rock, clambering uphill faster than he would have believed possible, his anger hot and bright. He was ready to wreak vengeance upon the Brotherhood for what they had done in the name of spite, and nothing was going to stop him. Loken knew that he had to reach the breach before the Brotherhood realized that its strategy had not killed all the attackers, and he kept moving upwards at a fast pace, using all the increased muscle power his armor afforded him. A storm of gunfire flashed from above, las shots and solid rounds spanging from the rocks and metal rubble. A heavy shell clipped his shoulder guard, spinning him around, but Loken shrugged off the impact and charged on. The roaring tide of Astartes warriors climbed the breach, the last rays of the morning sun glinting from the brilliant green of their armor. To see so many warriors in battle was magnificent, an unstoppable wave of death that would sweep away all resistance in a storm of gunfire and blades. All tactics were moot now, the sight of Angron's fall robbing each and every warrior of any sense of restraint. Loken could see the gleaming silver armor of Brotherhood warriors as they climbed to what was left of the breach, dragging bipod-mounted heavy weapons with them. "Bolters!" he shouted. "Open fire!" The crest of the breach vanished as a spray of bolter rounds impacted. Sparks and chunks of flesh flew as Astartes rounds found homes in flesh, and though many were firing from the hip, most were deadly accurate. The noise was incredible. Hundreds of bolter rounds ripping enemy warriors to shreds, and skirling wolf howls ringing in his ears as the Astartes swept over the breach and reverted once again to the persona of the lunar wolves. Loken threw aside his bolter, the magazine empty, and drew his chainsword, thumbing the activation stud as he vaulted the smoking rocks that had crushed Angron and the World Eaters. Beyond the walls of the Iron Citadel was a wide esplanade, its surface strewn with gun positions and coils of razor wire. A shell-battered keep was built into the mountainside, but its gates were in pieces, and black smoke poured from its gun ports. Brotherhood warriors were streaming back from the ruin of the walls towards these prepared positions, but they had horribly misjudged the timing of their fallback. The sons of Horus were already amongst them, hacking them down with brutal arcs of chain blades or gunning them down as they fled. Loken tore his way through a knot of Brotherhood warriors who turned to fight, killing 3 of them in as many strokes of his sword, and backhanding his elbow into the last opponent's head, smashing his skull to splinters. All was pandemonium as the sons of Horus ran amok within the precincts of the Iron Citadel, its defenders slaughtered in frantic moments of unimaginable violence. Loken killed and killed, reveling in the shedding of enemy blood and realizing that with this victory, the war would be over. With that thought, the cold reality of what was happening penetrated the red fog of his rage. They had won, and already he could see the victory turning into a massacre. "Garviel!" a desperate voice called over the suit box. "Garviel, can you hear me?" "Loud and clear, Tarek," answered Loken. "We have to stop this," cried Torgadden. "We've won! It's over! Get a hold of your company!" "Understood," said Loken, pleased that Torgadden had realized the same thing as he had. Soon the Intersuit Vox network was alive with barked orders to halt the attack that quickly passed down the chain of command. By the time the echoes of battle were finally stilled, Loken could see that the Astartes had just barely managed to hold themselves from plunging into an abyss of barbarity, out of which they might never have climbed. Blood, bodies, and the stink of battle filled the day, and as Loken looked up into the beautifully clear sky, he could see that the sun was almost at its zenith. The final storm of the Iron Citadel had taken less than an hour. yet had cost the lives of the Primarch, hundreds of the World Eaters, thousands of the Brotherhood, and the Emperor alone knew how many sons of Horus. The mass slaughter seemed such a terrible waste of life for what was a paltry prize. Ruined cities, a battered and hostile populace, and a world that was sure to rebel as soon as it had the chance. Was this world's compliance worth such bloodshed? The majority of the Brotherhood warriors had died in those last enraged minutes, but many more were prisoners of the Sons of Horus, rather than their victims. Loken removed his helmet and gulped in a lungful of the clear air, its crispness tasting like the sweetest wine after the recycled air of his armor. He made his way through the wreckage of battle, the torn remnants of enemy warriors strewn like offal throughout the esplanade. He found Torgadden on his knees, also with his helmet off and breathing deeply. His friend looked up as Loken approached and smiled weakly.
Well, we did it.
Yes, agreed Loken, sadly, looking around at the crimson spoils of victory.
We did, didn't we?
Loken had killed thousands of enemies before, and he would kill thousands more in wars yet to be fought. But something in the savagery of this battle had soured his notion of triumph. The two captains turned as they heard the tramp of booted feet behind them, seeing the lead battalions of the Byzant Janizars finally climbing into the citadel. Loken could see the horror on the soldiers' faces, and knew that the glory of the Astartes would be tarnished for every man who set foot inside.
Varus is here,
said Loken.
just in time, eh?
Said Torgadden.
This'll sweeten his mood towards us.
Loken nodded and simply watched as the richly appointed command units of the Byzant Janizars entered the citadel, their tall blue banners snapping in the wind, and brilliantly decorated officers scanning the battlefield. Hector Varvarus stood at the crest of the breach and surveyed the scene of carnage, his horrified expression easy to read even from a distance. Loken felt his resentment towards Varvarus swell as he thought,
This is what we were created for. What else do you expect?
Looks like their leaders are here to surrender to Varvarus, said Torgadden, pointing to a long column of beaten men and women marching from the smoking ruins of the inner keep, red and silver banners carried before them. 100 warriors in battered plate armor marched with them, their long-barreled weapons shouldered and pointed at the ground. Robed Magos, helmeted officers led the column, their faces downcast and resigned to their capitulation. With the storm of the esplanade, the citadel was lost, and the leaders of the Brotherhood knew it.
Come on, said Loken. This is history. Since there are no remembrances here, we might as well be part of this.
Yes, agreed Torgadden, pushing himself to his feet. The two captains drew parallel with the column of beaten Brotherhood warriors, and soon every one of the sons of Horus who had survived the escalade surrounded them. Loken watched Varvarus climb down the rearward slope of the breach and make his way towards the leaders of the Orician technocracy. He bowed formally and said,
My name is Lord Commander Hector Varvarus, commander of the Emperor's armies in the 63rd Expedition. To whom do I have the honor of addressing?
An elderly warrior in gold-plate armor stepped from the ranks of men, his black and silver heraldry carried on a personal banner pole by a young lad of no more than 16 years.
I am Ephraim Guardia, he said, Senior Preceptor of the Brotherhood Chapter Command and Castellan of the Iron Citadel.
Loken could see the tension on Guardia's face, and knew that it was taking the commander all his self-control to remain calm in the face of the massacre he had just witnessed.
Tell me,
said Guardia,
is this how all wars are waged in your Imperium?
War is a harsh master, Senior Preceptor, answered Varvarus.
Blood is spilled, and lives are lost. I feel the sorrow of your losses, but excess of grief for the dead is madness. It is an injury to the living, and the dead know it not. Spoken like a tyrant and a killer,
snarled Guardia, and Varvarus bristled with anger at his defeated foe's lack of etiquette.
Given time, you will see that war is not what the Imperium stands for,
promised Varvarus.
The Emperor's Great Crusade is designed to bring reason and illumination to the lost strands of mankind. I promise you that this unpleasantness will soon be forgotten as we go forward into a new age of peace.
Guardia shook his head and reached into a pouch at his side. "I think you are wrong. But you have beaten us, and my opinion means nothing anymore." He unrolled a sheet of parchment and said, "I shall read our declaration to you, Varus. All my officers have signed it, and it will stand as a testament to our attempts to defy you." Clearing his throat, Guardia began to read. "We fought your treacherous war master to preserve our way of life and to resist the yoke of imperial rule. It was, in truth, not for glory, nor riches, nor for honor that we fought, but for freedom, which no honest man could ever wish to give up. However, the greatest of our warriors cannot stand before the savagery of your war, and rather than see our culture exterminated, we surrender this citadel and our worlds to you. May you rule in peace more kindly than you make war." Before Varus could react to the senior preceptor's declaration, the rubble behind him shifted and groaned, cracks splitting the rock and metal as something vast and terrible heaved upwards from beneath the ground. At first, Loken thought that it was the second seismic charge he had feared, but then he saw that these tremors were far more localized. Janizars scattered, and men shouted in alarm as more debris clattered from the breach. Loken gripped the hilt of his sword as he saw many of the Brotherhood warriors reach for their weapons. Then the breach exploded with a grinding crack of ruptured stone, and something immense and red erupted from the ground with a bestial roar of hate and bloodlust. Soldiers fell away from the red giant, hurled aside by the violence of his sudden appearance. Angron towered over them, bloody and enraged, and Loken marveled that he could still be alive after thousands of tons of rock had engulfed him. But Angron was a Primarch, and what, save for an anatheme, could lay one such as him low?
"Blood for Horus!"
shouted Angron, and leapt from the breach. The Primarch landed with a thunderous impact that split the stone beneath him, his chainglaive sweeping out and cleaving the entire front rank of Brotherhood warriors to bloody ruin. Ephraim Guardia died in the first seconds of Angron's attack, his body cloven through the chest with a single blow. Angron howled in battle lust as he hacked his way through the Brotherhood with great, disemboweling sweeps of his monstrous roaring weapon. The madness of his slaughter was terrifying, but the warriors of the Brotherhood were not about to die without a fight. Loken shouted, "No! Stop!" But it was already too late. The remainder of the Brotherhood shouldered their weapons and began firing on the sons of Horus and the rampaging Primarch. "Open fire!" shouted Loken, knowing he had no choice. Gunfire tore through the ranks of the Brotherhood, the point-blank firefight a lethal firestorm of explosive bolter rounds. The noise was deafening and horrifyingly brief, as the Brotherhood were mercilessly gunned down by the Astartes or hacked apart by Angron. Within seconds, it was over, and the last remnants of the Brotherhood were no more. Desperate cries for medics sounded from the command units of the Janizars, and Loken saw a group of bloody soldiers on their knees around a fallen officer, his cream greatcoat drenched in blood. The gold of his medals gleamed in the cold midday light, and as one of the kneeling soldiers shifted position, Loken realized the identity of the fallen man. Hector Varus lay in a spreading pool of blood, and even from a distance, Loken could see that there would be no saving him. The man's body had been ripped open from the inside, the gleaming ends of splintered ribs jutting from his chest, where it was clear a bolter round had detonated within him. Loken wept to see this fragile piece broken, and dropped his sword in disgust at what had happened, and at what he had been forced to do. With Angron's senseless attack, the lives of his warriors had been threatened, and he had no other choice but to order the attack. Still, he regretted it. The Brotherhood had been honorable foes, and the sons of Horus had butchered them like cattle. Angron stood in the midst of the carnage, his glaive spraying the warriors nearest him with spatters of blood from the roaring chainblades. The sons of Horus cheered in praise of the World Eater's Primarch, but Loken felt soul-sick at such a barbaric sight. "That was no way for warriors to die," said Torgadden. "Their deaths shame us all." Loken didn't answer. He couldn't. 21. Illumination. With the fall of the Iron Citadel, the war on Aureus was over, The Brotherhood was destroyed as a fighting force, and though there were still pockets of resistance to be mopped up, the fighting was as good as over. Casualties on both sides had been high, most especially in the army units of the expedition. Hector Varvarus was brought back to the fleet with due reverence, and his body returned to space in a ceremony attended by the highest-ranking officers of the expeditions. The War Master himself spoke the Lord Commander's eulogy, the passion and depths of his sorrow plain to see.
Heroism is not only in the man, but in the occasion, the War Master had said of Lord Commander Varvarus. It is only when we look now and see his success that men will say that it was good fortune. It was not. We lost thousands of our best warriors that day, and I feel the loss of every one. Hector Varvarus was a leader who knew that to march with the gods, one must wait until he hears their footsteps sounding through events, and then leap up and grasp the hem of their robes. Varvarus has gone from us, but he would not want us to pause in mourning, for history is a relentless master. It has no present, only the past rushing into the future. To try to hold fast to it is to be swept aside, and that, my friends, will never happen. Not while I am War Master. Those men who fought and bled with Varvarus shall have this world to stand sentinel over, so that his sacrifice will never be forgotten. Other speakers had said their farewells to the Lord Commander, but none with the War Master's eloquence. True to his word, Horus ensured that army units that had been loyal to Varvarus were appointed to minister the worlds he had died to make compliant. A new Imperial commander was installed, and the martial power of the fleet began the time-consuming process of regrouping in preparation for the next stage of the crusade. Carcass's billet stank of ink and printing fumes, the crude mechanical bulk printer working overtime to print enough copies of the latest edition of The Truth Is All We Have. Though his output had been less prolific of late, the Bondsman No. 7 box was nearly empty. Ignace Carcassy remembered wondering, a lifetime ago it seemed, whether or not the lifespan of his creativity could be measured in the quantity of paper he had left to fill. Such thoughts seemed meaningless, given the powerful desire to write that was upon him these days. He sat on the edge of his cot bed, the last remaining place for him to sit, penning the latest scurrilous piece of verse for his pamphlet and humming contentedly to himself. Papers filled the billet, strewn across the floor, tacked upon the walls, or piled on any surface flat enough to hold them. Scribbled notes, abandoned odes, and half-finished poems filled the space. But such was the fecundity of his muse that he didn't expect to exhaust it any time soon. He'd heard that the war with the Euretians was over, the final citadel having fallen to the sons of Horus a couple of days ago, in what the ship's scuttlebutt was already calling the White Mountains Massacre. He didn't yet know the full story, but several sources he'd cultivated over the 10 months of the war would surely garner him some juicy tidbits. He heard a curt knock on his door shutter and shouted, "Come in!" Carcassy kept on writing as the shutter opened, too focused on his words to waste a single second of his time. "Yes," he said. "What can I do for you?" No answer was forthcoming, so Carcassy looked up in irritation to see an armored warrior standing mutely before him. At first, Carcassy felt a thrill of panic, seeing the man's longsword and the hard metallic gleam of a holstered pistol. But he relaxed as he saw that the man was Petrona Levivar's bodyguard, Magard, or something like that. "Well?" he asked again. "Was there something you wanted?" Magard said nothing, and Carcassy remembered that the man was mute, thinking it foolish that anyone would send someone who couldn't speak as a messenger. "I can't help you unless you can tell me why you're here," said Carcassy, speaking slowly to ensure that the man understood. In response, Magard removed a folded piece of paper from his belt and held it out with his left hand. The warrior made no attempt to move closer to him, so with a resigned sigh, Carcassy put aside the bondsman and pushed his bulky frame from the bed. Carcassy picked his way through the piles of notebooks and took the proffered paper. It was a sepia-colored papyrus, as was produced in Egyptian spires, with cross-hatched patterning throughout. A little gaudy for his tastes, but obviously expensive. "So, who might this be from?" asked Carcassy, before again remembering that this messenger couldn't speak.
He shook his head with an indulgent smile, unfolded the papyrus, and cast his eyes over the note's contents. He frowned as he recognized the words as lines from his own poetry. Dark imagery and potent symbolism, but they were all out of sequence, plucked from a dozen different works. Carcassy reached the end of the note, and his bladder emptied in terror as he realized the import of the message and its bearer's purpose. Petronella paced the confines of her stateroom, impatient to begin transcribing the latest thoughts of her bodyguard. The time Maggard had spent with the Astartes had been most fruitful, and she had already learned much that would otherwise have been hidden from her. Now a structure suggested itself, a tragic tale told in reverse order that opened on the Primarch's deathbed, with a triumphal coda that spoke of his survival and of the glories yet to come. After all, she didn't want to confine herself to only one book. She even had a prospective title, one that she felt conveyed the correct gravitas of her subject matter, yet also included her in its meaning. Petronella would call this masterpiece In the Footsteps of Gods, and had already taken its first line, the most important part of the tale where her reader was either hooked or left cold, from her own terrified thoughts at the moment of the War Master's collapse. I was there, the day that all. It had all the right tonal qualities, leaving the reader in no doubt that they were about to read something profound, yet keeping the end of the story a jealously guarded secret. Everything was coming together, but Maggard was late in returning from his latest foray into the world of the Astartes, and her patience was wearing thin. She had already reduced Babeth to tears in her impatient frustration, and had banished her maidservant to the tiny chamber that served as her sleeping quarters. She heard the sound of the door to her stateroom opening in the receiving room, and marched straight through to reprimand Maggard for his tardiness. "What time do you call—" she began, but the words trailed off as she saw that the figure standing before her wasn't Maggard. It was the War Master. He was dressed in simple robes and looked more magnificent than she could ever remember seeing him. A fierce anima surrounded him, and she found herself unable to speak as he looked up, the full force of his personality striking. Standing at the door behind him was the hulking form of First Captain Abaddon. Horus looked up as she entered and nodded to Abaddon, who closed the door at his back. "Miss Viva," said the War Master. It took an effort of will on Petronella's part for her to find her voice. "Yes, my lord," she stammered, horrified at the mess of her stateroom, and that the War Master should see it so untidy. She must remember to punish Babeth for neglecting her duties. I wasn't expecting..." Horus held up his hand to soothe her concerns, and she fell silent. "I know I have been neglectful of you," said the War Master. "You have been privy to my innermost thoughts, and I allowed the concerns of the war against the technocracy to command my attention." "My lord, I never dreamed you gave me such consideration," said Petronella. "You would be surprised," smiled Horus. "Your writing goes well?" "Very well, my lord," said Petronella. "I have been prolific since we last met." "Yes," asked Horus. "Of course," she said, thrilled that he should take an interest in her work. She had to force herself to walk, not run, into her writing room, indicating the papers stacked on her escritoire. "It's all a bit of a jumble, but everything I've written is here," beamed Petronella. "I would be honored if you would critique my work. After all, who is more qualified?" "Quite," agreed Horus, following her to the escritoire and taking up her most recent output. His eyes scanned the pages, reading and digesting the contents quicker than any mortal man ever could. She searched his face for any reaction to her words, but he was as unreadable as a statue, and she began to worry that he disapproved. Eventually, he placed the papers back on the escritoire and said, "It is very good. You are a talented documentarist." "Thank you, my lord," the power of his praise like a tonic in her veins. "Yes," said Horus, his voice cold. "It's almost a shame that no one will ever read it." Maggard reached up and grabbed the front of Carcassy's robe, spinning him around and hooking his arm around the poet's neck. Carcassy struggled in the powerful grip, helpless against Maggard's superior strength. "Please," he gasped, his terror making his voice shrill. "No, please don't." Maggard said nothing, and Carcassy heard the snap of leather as the warrior's free hand popped the stud on his holster. Carcassy fought, but he could do nothing, the crushing force of Maggard's arm around his neck, robbing him of breath and blurring his vision. Carcassy wept bitter tears as time slowed. He heard the slow rasp of the pistol sliding from his holster and the harsh click as the hammer was drawn back. He bit his tongue. Bloody foam gathered in the corners of his mouth. Snot and tears mingled on his face. His legs scrabbled on the floor. Papers flew in all directions. Cold steel pressed into his neck. The barrel of Maggard's pistol jammed tight under his jaw. Carcassy smelled the gun oil. He wished. The hard bang of the pistol shot echoed deafeningly in the cramped billet. At first, Petronella wasn't sure she'd understood what the War Master meant. Why wouldn't people be able to read her work? Then she saw the cold, merciless light in Horace's eyes. "My lord, I'm not sure I understand you," she said, haltingly. "Yes, you do," she whispered, backing away from him. The War Master followed her, his steps slow and measured. "When we spoke in the apothecarium, I let you look inside the box, and for that I am truly sorry. Only one person has a need to know the things inside my head, and that person is me. The things I have seen and done, the things I am going to do." "Please, my lord," said Petronella, backing out of her writing room and into the receiving room. "If you are unhappy with what I've written, it can be revised, edited. I would give you approval on everything, of course." Horace shook his head, drawing closer to her with every step. Petronella felt her eyes filled with tears, as she knew that this couldn't be happening. The War Master would not be trying to scare her. They must be playing some cruel joke on her. The idea of the Astartes making a fool of her stung Petronella's wounded pride, and the part of her that had snapped angrily at the War Master upon their first meeting rose to the surface. "I am the Palatina Majoria of House Carpinus, and I demand that you respect that," she cried, standing firm before the War Master. "You can't scare me like this." "I'm not trying to scare you," said Horace, reaching out to hold her by the shoulders. "You're not?" asked Petronella, his words filling her with relief. She'd known that this couldn't be right, that there had to be some mistake. "No," said Horace, his hand sliding towards her neck. "I am illuminating you." Her neck broke with one swift snap of his wrist. The Medicae cell was cramped, but clean and well maintained. Mercedes Oliton sat by the bed and wept softly to herself, tears running freely down her cold, dark skin. Kirill Sinderman sat with her, and he too shed tears as he held the hand of the bed's occupant. Euphrates Keeler lay unmoving, her skin pale and smooth, with a sheen to it that made it look like polished ceramic. Since she had faced the horror in Archive Chamber 3, she had lain unmoving and unresponsive in this Medicae bay. Sinderman had told Mercedes what had happened, and she found herself torn between wanting to believe him and calling him delusional. His talk of a demon, and of Euphrates standing before it with the power of the Emperor pouring through her, was too fantastical to be true, wasn't it? She wondered if he'd told anyone else of it. The apothecaries and medics could find nothing physically wrong with Euphrates Keeler, save for the eagle-shaped burn on her hand that refused to fade. Her vital signs were stable, and her brainwave activity registered normal. No one could explain it, and no one had any idea how to wake her from this coma-like state. Mercedes came to visit Euphrates as often as she could, but she knew that Sinderman came every day, spending several hours at a time with her. Sometimes they would sit together, talking to Euphrates, telling her of the events happening on the planets below, the battles that had been fought, or simply passing on ship gossip. Nothing seemed to reach the images, and Mercedes sometimes wondered if it might not be a kindness to let her die. What could be worse for a person like Euphrates than being trapped by her own flesh, with no ability to reason, to communicate or express herself? She and Sinderman had arrived together today, and each instantly knew that the other had been crying. The news of Ignace Carcassy's suicide had hit them all hard, and Mercedy still couldn't believe how he could have done such a thing. A suicide note had been found in his billet, which was said to have been composed in verse. It spoke volumes of Ignis's enormous conceit that he made his last goodbye in his own poetry. They had wept for another lost soul, and then they sat on either side of Euphrates' bed, holding each other's and Keeler's hands as they spoke of better times. Both turned as they heard a soft knock behind them. A thin-faced man, wearing the uniform of the Legio Mortis and an earnest face, stood framed in the doorway. Behind him, Mercedy could see that the corridor was filled with people. "Is it all right if I come in?" he asked. Mercedy Ollerton said, "Who are you?" "My name's Titus Cassar, Moderati Primus of the Dies Irae. I've come to see the saint." They met in the observation deck. The lighting kept low, and the darkness of space leavened only by the reflected glare of the planets they had just conquered. Loken stood with his palm against the armored viewing bay, believing that something fundamental had happened to the sons of Horus and Aureus, but not knowing what. Torgarden joined him moments later, and Loken welcomed him with a brotherly embrace, grateful to have so loyal a comrade. They stood in silence for some time, each lost in thought as they watched the defeated planets turn in space below them. The preparations for departure were virtually complete, and the fleet was ready to move on, though neither warrior had any idea of where they were going. Eventually, Torgarden broke the silence.
So, what do we do?
"I don't know, Tarek," replied Loken.
I really don't. I thought not,
said Torgarden, holding up a glass test tube with something in it that reflected soft light with a golden gleam.
This won't help then.
"What is it?" asked Loken.
These, said Torgarden, are the bolt-round fragments removed from Hector Varvarus.
Bolt-round fragments? Why do you have them?
Because they're ours.
What do you mean?
I mean they're ours, repeated Torgarden. The bolt that killed the Lord Commander came from an Astartes bolter, not from one of the Brotherhood's guns.
Loken shook his head. No. There must be some mistake.
There's no mistake. Apothecary Vadden tested these fragments himself. They're ours, no question.
You think Varvarus caught a stray round? Torgarden shook his head.
The wound was dead center, Garviel. It was an aimed shot.
Loken and Torgarden both understood the implications, and Loken felt his melancholy rise at the thought of Varvarus having been murdered by one of their own. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Loken said, "In the wake of such deceit and destruction, shall we despair? Or is faith and honor the spur to action?"
What's that?
asked Torgarden. "It's part of a speech I read in a book that Kirill Sinderman gave me," said Loken. "It seemed appropriate given where we find ourselves now."
That's true enough,
agreed Torgarden. "What are we becoming, Tarek?" asked Loken. "I don't recognize our legion anymore. When did it change?"
The moment we encountered the technocracy.
"No," said Loken. "I think it was on Davin. Nothing's been the same since then. Something happened to the sons of Horus there. Something vile and dark and evil."
Do you realize what you're saying?
"I do," replied Loken. "I'm saying that we have to uphold the truth of the Imperium of mankind, no matter what evil may assail it." Torgarden nodded.
The Mornival Oath.
"Evil has found its way into our legion, Tarek, and it's up to us to cut it out. Are you with me?" asked Loken.
Always,
said Torgarden, and the two warriors shook hands in the old Terran way. The War Master's sanctum was dimly lit, the cold glow of the bridge instruments the only source of illumination. The room was full. The core of the War Master's officers and commanders gathered around the table. The War Master sat at his customary place at the head of the table, while Aximand and Abaddon stood behind him, their presence a potent reminder of his authority. Malakhurst, Regulus, Erebus, Princeps Turnit of the Legio Mortis, and various other hand-picked army commanders filled out the rest of the gathering. Satisfied that everyone who needed to be there had arrived, Horus leaned forwards and began to speak. "My friends, We begin the next phase of our campaign among the stars soon, and I know that you're all curious as to where we travel next. I will tell you, but before I do, I need every one of you to be aware of the magnitude of the task before us. He could see he had everyone's attention, and continued. I am going to topple the Emperor from his throne on Terra, and take his place as the master of mankind. The enormity of his words was not lost on the assembled warriors, and he gave them a few minutes to savor their weight, enjoying the look of alarm that crossed each man's face. Be not afraid. You are amongst friends, chuckled Horus. I have spoken to you all individually over the course of the war with the technocracy, but this is the first time you have been gathered, and I have openly spoken of our destiny. You shall be my war council, those to whom I entrust the furthering of my plan. Horus rose from his seat, continuing to speak as he circled the table. Take a moment, and look at the face of the man sitting next to you. In the coming fight, he will be your brother, for all others will turn from us when we make our intentions plain. Brother will fight brother, and the fate of the galaxy will be the ultimate prize. We will face accusations of heresy and cries of treason, but they will fall from us because we are right. Make no mistake about that. We are right, and the Emperor is wrong. He has sorely misjudged me if he thinks I will stand by while he abandons his realm in his quest for godhood and leaves us amid the destruction of his rampant ambition. The Emperor commands the loyalty of millions of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of Astartes warriors. His battle fleets reach across the stars from one side of the galaxy to the other. The 63rd expedition cannot hope to match such numbers or resources. You all know this to be the case. But even so, we have the advantage. What advantage is that? Asked Malachurst, exactly on cue. We have the advantage of surprise. No one yet suspects us of having learned the Emperor's true plan, and in that lies our greatest weapon. But what of Magnus? Asked Malachurst urgently. What happens when Leman Russ returns him to Terra? Horus smiled. Calm yourself, Mal. I have already contacted my brother Russ and illuminated him with the full breadth of Magnus's treacherous use of demonic spells and conjurations. He was suitably angry, and I believe I have convinced him that to return Magnus to Terra would be a waste of time and effort. Malachurst returned Horus's smile. Magnus will not leave Prospero alive. No, agreed Horus. He will not. What of the other legions? Asked Regulus. They will not sit idly by while we make war upon the Emperor. How do you propose to negate them? A worthy question, Adept, said Horus, circling the table to stand at his shoulder. We are not without allies ourselves. Fulgrim is with us, and he now goes to win Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands over to our cause. Lorgar too understands the necessity of what must be done, and both bring the full might of their legions to my banner. That still leaves many others, pointed out Erebus. Indeed it does, Chaplain. But with your help, others may join us. Under the guise of the Chaplain Edict, we will send emissaries to each of the legions to promulgate the formation of warrior lodges within them. From small beginnings, we may win many to our cause. That will take time, said Erebus. Horus nodded. It will, yes, but it will be worth it in the long term. In the meantime, I have dispatched mobilization orders to those legions I do not believe we can sway. The Ultramarines will muster at Calth to be attacked by Cor Farron of the Word-Bearers, and the Blood Angels have been sent to the Cygnus Cluster, where Sanguinius shall be mired in blood. Then we make a swift, decisive stroke on Terra. That still leaves other legions, said Regulus. I know, answered Horus. But I have a plan that will remove them as a threat to us once and for all. I will lure them into a trap from which none will escape. I will set the Emperor's Imperium ablaze, and from the ashes will arise a new master of mankind. And where will you set this trap? Asked Malachurst. A place not far from here, said Horace.
The Istvan system.
That was False Gods by Graham McNeill, read by Toby Longworth. This recording is copyrighted by Games Workshop 2014.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.